Investments into early stage company take a variety of forms, but they usually fall into two traditional buckets: debt and equity. Let's start by talking about debt. So you should be familiar with this in the form of mortgages or other bank debts or even credit cards, right? So you borrow some money, right? The investor hands your company a fixed amount of money, and in return you promise to pay a fixed amount every month for a certain number of months at a fixed interest rate. Right? So you know how much you're going to pay. The problem with using debt to fund early stage companies is that most of them don't survive long enough to pay off the debt. And so in order to have the investor have a positive return on their capital, have a profit, they would have to charge an enormous amount of interest, right? So if you remember back to that VC number, their return on investment was about 20%. But that doesn't mean that they could have charged 20% to all those companies, because all the zeros would have been 0, and the ones that succeeded would be 20, and the average then wouldn't be 20, it would be way below 20. So they would have to charge every company something on the order of 300% interest or 400% interest or really 800% interest, and that's just crazy. No company would be able to pay that up front. So for that reason, when you're taking the very first money from investors into your company, debt doesn't work as a good form. That said, the most common way to take money from investors is debt. And let me make that clear. It's not that form of debt. It's what's called convertible debt. And so what convertible debt is a loan. So it takes the form of X dollars from investor to company, and it has an interest rate that's listed on it, but the interest isn't paid. At least it's not paid on a monthly basis. And the key to convertible debt is that it has a timeline to it and an expectation that before the deadline on the debt, there will be a round of funding that has to do with equity. I'll explain what that is in a moment. But there will be a round of equity, and that this note holder, whoever is lending the money in the form of convertible note, will convert their repayment into equity later. And there's often a discount given to those note holders for the risk they're taking and giving the money now. So let me give you a quick example of this. It would be you're raising $200,000, and so you go to investors and you say, I would like to raise $200,000 in the form of a convertible note with a 20% discount on the next round and a 5% interest rate. And we will close that round in the next year, and so we'll put a 12-month deadline on this. And these days there's a lot more terms that get attached to this, but that's the general big terms. And so that expectation is that within 12 months you'll go raise even more money from somewhere else, and that note holder that had a $200,000 loan to you with a discount and 5% interest will then participate in that next round with a discount on the price, and you tack on 5% to their $200,000 to say how much money they put in. Okay? Something along those lines. You can read about that in great detail. Search for convertible debt on the internet. You can go and spend hours and hours looking through lots of convertible notes that are available online and lots of descriptions for how that works. Convertible debt exists in order to get to what's the real deal, which is equity. And equity just means that the investor is buying a share of your company, a percentage ownership in your company. And that takes the form of X dollars from investor to company in exchange for a fixed number of shares. And you will compute this as a specific number of shares and a percentage of the total number of shares that are outstanding. So when you formed your company, or when you do form your company, if you haven't done that yet, you and your lawyers will come up with a number of shares that are issued to you and your co-founders and anyone else involved in founding the company. And this number can be anything. It could be 1 each, could be 100 each, or 1 million each. It doesn't matter. And then the investors are buying a certain number of shares themselves that dilute you. So you originally, let's just make it simple. You alone own a company and there are 100 shares, and an investor comes along and buys 30 shares. Now there are 130 shares. The investor owns 30 divided by 130%. You own 100 divided by 130%. It's as simple as that. The percentages just keep going down as you add more investors. The idea is that the value of each share goes up, and therefore you are owning a smaller percentage of a larger value as you sell these equity shares. Now, the investors like to buy equity because it then allows them to profit when the company gets sold later on in life, or when the company starts paying dividends, or however else the company is going to pay back the investor for these dollars. Just to be clear, the expectation for angels and VCs and most investors is that they make more money back than they gave you. Right? So how does that happen? Most of the time it happens via acquisition. So that most of the time the investor's putting in, again, let's say $200,000, and they're owning a small percentage of your company, let's say 20%. And so when you sell your company for $100 million, they get 20% of that $100 million, more or less. Right? That'd be a much bigger than 10x. That'd be a really good investment. Those are not the only two forms. There's one form that I use in my work at Fledge. It's called revenue-based investing. And I'll explain this because it may come up in your market. In this form, you take X dollars from the investor again, but instead of them getting a fixed interest rate or a fixed number of shares, they're buying a fixed percentage of your future revenues. So they pay you X dollars, you're giving them back 4, 5, 6, 7% of your revenues until you have repaid them a multiple of the money they gave you. And the norms in the industry are about 3x if you're a very new company and 2x if you're a growth company. And there's no time limit to this. You set the fixed percentage rate of revenues so that it's a reasonable time that returns them a reasonable investment. And again, reasonable varies, but in an early stage investment, you set it so that it be about 20%, equivalent of 20%. And if it's a growth industry, maybe you set it equivalent to 12 or 15%. Okay? So this is an up and coming area. It's got lots of benefits. We'll talk about it in another lecture.